The moment Perry Prescott laid eyes on Stella Keating, he spent every last cent he had in his pocket on a wagon seat he did not need, just to ensure he would be sitting beside her when the wheels began to roll west. It was the spring of 1872, and the town of Abilene, Kansas, was alive with the particular kind of restless energy that only came when a new wagon train was preparing to depart. The main street ran thick with mud from 2 days of rain, and the storefronts were still dripping from their overhanging eaves, little silver curtains of water catching the morning light. Horses stood hitched to posts with their heads hanging low, unbothered by the noise and the crowd. Children darted between the legs of adults. Merchants called out prices. And somewhere in the organized chaos of 100 people preparing to leave everything they had ever known for a stretch of land that existed mostly in their imaginations, Perry Prescott stood outside the wagon master's table and watched a woman he had never met read a handwritten list with the kind of careful attention that made him forget, temporarily, that he had anywhere at all to be. He was 26 years old, broad across the shoulders from years of ranch work, with dark hair that curled at his collar and eyes the color of river water on an overcast day. He had calluses on both palms and a scar on his jaw from a wire fence that had caught him sideways when he was 19. He wore a canvas duster that had seen better years and boots that were good and solid if not exactly new. He was not a man who thought of himself as particularly remarkable, which was part of what made him remarkable. He worked hard. He kept his word. He did not pick fights, and he did not run from them either when they found him. He was on his way to Colorado Territory, where a friend from his Army days had staked out a parcel of land and needed a partner willing to put in the labor to build something lasting. It was a practical mission. Perry was a practical man. He had his possessions loaded in a supply crate in the back of one of the wagons, had already paid his freight fee, and had intended to ride one of the company horses alongside the wagon train the way the single men without families generally did. He had not planned to buy a seat inside a wagon at all. Stella Keating changed that plan without knowing she existed. She was standing at the wagon master's table, her dark auburn hair twisted back in a practical knot at the nape of her neck, though several pieces of it had escaped and were moving softly in the Kansas breeze. She wore a pale blue traveling dress that had a small tear at the left cuff, carefully hemmed so it would not fray further, and she held her reading list in both hands as if it were something of great importance. Which, for her, it was. It contained every item she had packed, every dollar she had spent, and every plan she had made for the next 6 months of her life. She was 23 years old and alone, which in 1872 was a thing that required constant explanation to people who felt uncomfortable in the presence of a woman making her own decisions. She had explained herself in Abilene more times in the past 4 days than she cared to count. Her mother had died 2 years prior, her father 3 years before that, and her older brother Thomas, who had gone ahead to Oregon Territory to establish a homestead, had sent word that there was land enough for her, a proper house being built, and a community of good people. He had sent money for the journey. She had supplemented it with what she had saved from 2 years of working as a seamstress and a part-time schoolteacher in a small Missouri town where everybody knew her business and most of them felt entitled to share opinions about it. Oregon was a long way from Missouri, but she had decided it was exactly far enough. The wagon master, a broad-shouldered man named Cletus Horn with a white mustache and the weathered skin of someone who had made this crossing more times than he could easily recall, was explaining the seating arrangements to the group clustered around his table. The train had 32 wagons. The majority of those wagons were family rigs, owned by the families themselves. But there were 6 communal wagons for passengers who had paid freight fees without bringing their own conveyances, and those 6 wagons had limited bench seating. The last available bench seat in the whole train, he was announcing, was in Wagon 4, which was driven by a reliable man named Ezra Webb and his wife Dorothy, who were good company and kept a tidy rig. The woman beside Perry, a heavy-set German widow named Mrs. Bauer who had been standing in front of him in the loose queue, shook her head and said something in German that Perry did not understand, then turned and walked away toward one of the family wagons where her daughter and son-in-law were waiting. Which meant the seat was still available. Which meant that seat, the very last seat inside a wagon on the entire train, was the seat right beside Stella Keating. Perry had no particular reason to buy it. He had a horse. He had his original plan. He had never in his life done something purely on impulse, not since he was young and impulsive, and had learned through experience that impulse was not always wisdom. He stepped forward and bought the seat anyway. He did not speak to Stella Keating that morning. He simply secured the seat and stepped back, and when the wagon master called for the train to form up and roll out just after 8 in the morning, Perry swung into the wagon bench and found himself sitting approximately 14 inches from a woman whose name he had not yet learned, staring out at the western horizon with the particular expression of a man who has surprised himself entirely. Stella Keating was looking at the horizon too. She had her list folded in the pocket of her dress and her hands folded in her lap, and her jaw was set with the kind of quiet determination that suggested she had made peace with whatever came next. The wagon jolted forward. The mules, 4 of them, heavy and unflappable, leaned into their harnesses. Dorothy Webb, who sat on the driver's bench with her husband Ezra, immediately began narrating everything she observed in a pleasant running commentary that neither Perry nor Stella was obligated to respond to, which was actually a considerable comfort. "Name's Perry Prescott," he said, after they had been rolling perhaps 20 minutes and it had become more awkward to remain silent than to introduce himself. Stella turned and looked at him with eyes that were, he noticed with some internal disruption, the most striking shade of green he had ever encountered. They were not simply green. They were green the way deep river water was green, with light moving through them in a way that suggested considerable depth underneath. "Stella Keating," she said. Her voice was clear and unhurried. She did not offer her hand, which was entirely appropriate for 1872, but she held his gaze for a steady moment before turning back to look at the Kansas plain rolling out ahead of them. "You traveling alone?" he asked. "I am," she said, without any particular defensiveness. "Colorado," he guessed. "Oregon," she said. "My brother has land there. You?" "Colorado," he said. "Friend of mine needs a partner on a land claim." She nodded as if this was a reasonable and complete answer, which it was. They rode in silence for a while. The sun was rising and warming the canvas sides of the wagon, and the smell of prairie grass and still damp earth came through the gaps in the covering. Dorothy Webb told them the name of every bird she spotted, of which there were many. Ezra Webb drove his mules with the quiet authority of long practice. Perry was not a man who filled silence unnecessarily. He had spent years working cattle ranges where conversation was a luxury and silence was a natural state. But riding beside Stella Keating, he found himself wanting to fill the quiet in a way he had not anticipated. He wanted to know everything about her. He restrained himself with considerable effort, because he recognized that a woman traveling alone in 1872 had almost certainly developed a healthy wariness of men who asked too many questions too quickly, and he did not want to be that kind of man. So he asked only one more thing. "You ever made a journey like this before?" "No," she said. She considered for a moment, then added, "But I have made journeys of other kinds. I think the preparation is the same. You pack what you need, you leave what you cannot carry, and you go." He thought about that for a long time afterward. The wagon train covered 12 miles the first day, which was an acceptable pace given the wet road conditions and the need for the animals and the company to find their rhythm together. Cleda's horn made camp beside a creek with good water, and the wagons formed their circle in the pattern that had been standard on overland trails for 30 years. Fires went up, cook pots came out, and the sounds of 60 families settling themselves into the routines of trail life filled the evening air. Perry set up his bedroll under the wagon, which was where the single men generally slept, and helped Ezra Webb unhitch the mules and water them at the creek. He was handy with animals, and Ezra noticed it and said so, which began a quiet friendship between the two men that would sustain itself across the weeks to come. Stella, meanwhile, had taken her small travel trunk from the wagon and organized her campsite with the systematic efficiency of someone who had given serious thought to every step of this journey before embarking on it. She had a good canvas ground cloth, a proper bedroll, a small cooking kit, and a supply of provisions that suggested she knew exactly what she was doing. She was not waiting for anyone to help her, and nobody offered anything she did not ask for. But Perry, carrying a bucket of water from the creek back toward the Webb's fire, walked past her position and stopped. "Can I bring you water?" he asked. She looked up from where she was kneeling beside her fire kit. "How much is left in the creek?" she asked. He laughed. He could not help it. It came out of him before he could decide whether it was appropriate, a genuine, warm, open laugh. "Enough for you," he said. "I promise." The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the neighboring territory of one. "Thank you," she said. "Yes." He brought her water. He did not linger. He went back to the Webb's fire and ate Dorothy's salt pork and cornbread, and watched the stars come out over Kansas, thinking about green eyes and careful plans, and the sound of a laugh he had not expected to make. The second day of travel brought better roads and a longer stretch of flat, open country that allowed the mules to find a good pace. The sky was enormous and blue, and Stella sat on the wagon bench with her hands in her lap and watched it the way some people watched the sea, with total absorption. Perry found himself watching her watch it. They talked more that second day. First in small pieces, the way people do when they are testing whether conversation is safe, and then in longer stretches as the morning warmed and Dorothy Webb fell asleep against her husband's shoulder, and the hypnotic motion of the wagon made the kind of easy quiet that encourages honesty. He learned that she had grown up in Ohio before her family moved to Missouri, that she had been teaching reading and sewing to children in a one-room schoolhouse for 2 years, that she had read every book she could borrow in 4 different Missouri counties, that she had opinions about the proper way to make biscuits, about the territorial government's handling of land grants, and about the relative merits of dogs versus cats as trail companions, a debate she resolved firmly in favor of dogs, citing their utility and their loyalty. She learned that he had grown up in Tennessee, that he had served in the Union Army, which had been a complicated thing in a Tennessee family, though he did not elaborate on why in any detail. That he had worked 3 different cattle ranches over 5 years before deciding he wanted land of his own. That he could read, but had not read as much as he should have, a deficit he was willing to admit. That he had owned a dog once, a yellow hound named Biscuit, which immediately won him considerable approval from across the bench. "You named your dog Biscuit," she said, in a tone that suggested this was the most sensible thing she had heard all week. "He was a golden color," Perry said. "It suited him." "What happened to him?" she asked. "Left him with the family I worked for in Texas when I rode north," Perry said. "They had 3 children who loved him. It was the right thing to do." She was quiet for a moment. "That was kind of you." "It was the right thing to do," he said again simply. He did not dress it up. It was the right thing to do, and he had done it, and that was the sum of it. Stella Keating, who had spent 2 years in a Missouri town full of men who dressed everything up in elaborate performance, found this plain-spoken quality so unexpectedly refreshing that she spent the rest of the afternoon slightly off balance in a way she found interesting rather than alarming. The wagon train moved through Kansas in a rhythm of days that were long and dusty and physically demanding, and evenings that were cool and strange and lit, with a quality of starlight that had no equivalent in towns with lamps and windows. By the end of the first week, the 60-odd families of the train had sorted themselves into the social configurations that would hold for the rest of the journey. The Webb's fire became a gathering spot, partly because Dorothy was an excellent cook, and partly because she had the gift of making everyone feel welcome without making anyone feel obligated. Perry and Stella ended up at that fire most evenings, along with a quiet Scotsman named Angus McRae who was headed to Idaho, and a young couple from Illinois named James and Clara Foster who had a baby girl named Ruth, and almost no idea what they were doing, but an infectious optimism that made everyone around them want to help. Perry became, without anyone formally agreeing to it, a kind of supplementary guide for the Foster family, helping James understand the terrain and the animals, and the 10,000 small decisions that a wagon trail demanded every single day. Stella taught Clara Foster to waterproof Ruth's blankets with the rendered fat she had brought specifically for that purpose, and to reorganize the Foster wagon so that the things they needed most often were on top, and the things they needed least were tucked in the back. These were the kinds of practical knowledge that the difference between a miserable journey and a manageable one. Clara Foster cried a little, from gratitude and from exhaustion, and Stella sat with her quietly in the way that some women have of offering comfort without making a production of it. Perry watched this from a polite distance and thought that Stella Keating was the most competent person on the entire train, including Cletus Horn himself, and that this was not a thing he should say out loud because she would probably find it condescending even though it was entirely meant as admiration. On the 9th night of the journey, there was a thunderstorm. It arrived in the late afternoon with very little warning, a great bank of dark cloud rolling in from the northwest with a speed that made Cletus Horn bark orders before anyone had quite registered the threat. The wagons formed a tighter circle. The animals were double secured. The canvas covers were checked and tied down. The cook fires were extinguished before the rain arrived in sheets, cold and aggressive, drumming against every surface with the particular violence of a plain storm that has had the entire continent to build up speed. Stella's bedroll was under the wagon, which provided some shelter, but not enough. The water was running in sheets along the ground, and she had been awake for 3 hours, sitting upright in her bedroll with her knees pulled to her chest, keeping herself dry with a combination of a wax-treated canvas sheet and a determination not to complain about it, which she was managing, but only just. Perry, who slept light and was also awake and also uncomfortable, crawled out from his own position under the wagon to check on the mules for Ezra, and found Stella sitting in the dark with her canvas sheet pulled around her like a tent, water dripping from the wagon boards above. "There's room in the wagon," he said. He kept his voice quiet and factual, the way a person says a thing that is simply true. "Dorothy said so when I helped Ezra secure the cover. She said anyone in the mud was welcome inside." Stella looked at him in the dark. She was entirely dignified in a way that was remarkable, given that she was sitting on wet ground wrapped in waxed canvas in the middle of a plains thunderstorm. "I am fine," she said. "I know you are," he said, "but Dorothy's offer stands if you change your mind." He went back to his own position. She did not change her mind that night. But in the morning, when the storm had passed and the air smelled clean and the sky was a rinsed brilliant blue, she walked to where he was drinking his coffee and said, "Thank you for asking." "Of course," he said. She held his gaze for a beat longer than she usually did, and then she went to help Dorothy with breakfast. The train crossed into Colorado territory at the end of the 3rd week, and the land changed in a way that was nearly theatrical, as if the territory wanted to make an impression. The mountains appeared on the western horizon first as a rumor, a dark blue line that might have been clouds, and then as an unmistakable presence, rising from the plain with a grandeur that made everyone fall quiet. The Foster's baby Ruth reached her hands toward the mountains as if she might hold them. Perry stood on the ground beside the wagon and looked at those mountains and felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight for a very long time. He had grown up landlocked, had spent years on flat ranges, and the sight of something that big and that permanent on the horizon was a thing that reached him somewhere below ordinary feeling. He turned and looked at Stella, who was standing a little apart from the group, and found that she was looking at the mountains with the same quality of attention she brought to everything, total and quiet and real. "Are you all right?" he asked. He walked over and stood beside her. "Yes," she said. "I think I understand now why people come all this way. For the mountains. For the feeling," she said, "that the world is bigger than whatever was pressing on you before." He thought about the Missouri town she had never named, but had described in enough detail that he could picture it clearly. A town that had opinions about a woman living alone and doing her own work and making her own plans. A town that was smaller than the life she wanted. "It is bigger," he said, "I promise you." She looked at him sideways with those green eyes, and then she looked back at the mountains. "I believe you," she said simply. It was, Perry would reflect later, the most significant thing she had ever said to him up to that point. Not because it was dramatic, because it was real. She was not a woman who said things she did not mean. The wagon train reached the area near Denver in the early days of the fourth week, and this was where it would begin splitting, sending different family groups off toward their various destinations. Colorado families would peel off here. Idaho families would continue northwest. Oregon families would take the northern route. Perry's stop was outside a settlement called Millhaven, a half-day's ride southwest of the main trail junction. His friend, a man named Daniel Carr, had sent detailed directions in his last letter. Perry had those directions memorized. Stella's trail would continue northwest for another 3 weeks, toward the Columbia River country where her brother Thomas had his land. They had not spoken about this ending. Not directly. The closer they got to the Colorado territory, the more aware Perry was of it, like a sound he could not stop hearing once he had noticed it. He told himself it was right and natural. He had come to Colorado. She was going to Oregon. He had a plan and a friend and a land claim waiting. She had a brother and a new life. These were good things. These were the things they had each set out to find. He told himself all of this with great thoroughness, and it did not help at all. On the evening before the junction, after the camp was made and the fires were lit and Dorothy Webb had made a remarkably good pot of venison stew that an older man named Hector had contributed from his hunting earlier in the day, Perry asked Stella if she would walk with him a little distance from the camp. It was a reasonable request, and she gave him a reasonable look and said yes. The evening was warm and dry, the Colorado air thin and clear, the mountains turning pink in the last of the sun. They walked along the creek that ran beside the camp, stepping over the flat stones, not in any particular hurry. The sounds of the camp faded behind them without disappearing entirely. Fireflies were beginning to emerge from the grass. "You leave tomorrow," she said before he could decide how to begin. "Yes," he said. "Millhaven, Southwest Junction. And your friend is expecting you." "Since last November," he said. She nodded. She bent down and picked up a flat stone from the creek edge and turned it over in her fingers. It was a thing she did sometimes when she was thinking, he had noticed. She was a person who thought before she spoke, and her hands were busy while she did it. "This has been good company," she said. She said it to the stone, and then she looked up at him. "You have been good company. I want you to know that." It was so careful, so measured. She was giving him what she genuinely felt and making sure it was contained within the proper borders of what was possible between them, because she was a practical woman and she knew what was possible. He was not, at that moment, feeling particularly practical. "Stella," he said. She waited. Her hands were still. "I would like to write to you," he said, "if you would allow it. I know letters through the postal routes to Oregon Territory take a long time, but I would like to write, and I would like to know that you received them and that you might, if you were inclined, write back." She looked at him for a long moment. In the fading Colorado light, with her hair coming loose from its knot and the mountains behind her turning from pink to purple, she looked like something from a painting that Perry had never actually seen but somehow always known the contents of. "I am inclined," she said. He exhaled very slowly. "Good," he said. She gave him her brother's address in Oregon Territory, which she had written on a small card she carried in her pocket. She had carried it in case of emergency, she explained. He took the card and held it carefully, and then he looked up at her and said, "I hope you find everything you're looking for there." "I hope you find everything you are looking for here," she said. They walked back to camp and nothing else was said, but there was a quality to the silence between them on that walk back that had not been there before. Fuller, warmer. The kind of silence that means something has been acknowledged rather than the kind that means nothing has been said. In the morning, the wagon train reached the junction and began its split. Perry stood beside his horse, already loaded and saddled, and watched the Webb's wagon roll north with Stella on the bench. She turned once and looked back at him. He raised one hand. She raised hers, a small, unhurried gesture, and then the wagon turned north and she was gone. He stood there until the wagon was a shape in the distance, and then he turned his horse southwest toward Millhaven and whatever was waiting there. Millhaven was a town, in the early stages of becoming itself. It had a main street with a general store, a blacksmith, a saloon, a small church, and a scattering of buildings that were still being decided on. Daniel Carr was waiting at the land claim, 3 miles outside of town, with a half-built house and a great deal of enthusiasm, and 2 of the scrawniest cows Perry had ever seen in his life. "I bought them cheap," Daniel admitted immediately, before Perry could say anything. "I can see why they were cheap," Perry said. But he shook his friend's hand, and he put his horse up and he looked at the land, and the land was good. It ran along the eastern slope of a foothills ridge with access to a creek and good southern exposure for growing, and the soil was the kind of dark, rich color that meant it would give back whatever you put into it. Perry walked the perimeter that first evening, and felt the earth under his boots and thought about what could be built here, and let himself be present in that thought. He also thought about a small card in his coat pocket with a Columbia River address written in neat, careful handwriting. He wrote his first letter to Stella Keating 1 week after arriving at Millhaven, sitting at the small table in the partial house with a candle and a piece of stationery he had purchased from the general store. He was not a natural letter writer. He sat for a long time looking at the blank paper before he started. Then he wrote plainly, the way he spoke, describing the land and the partial house and Daniel's unreasonably cheerful cows, and the way the mountains looked from the east slope in the morning. He wrote about Millhaven, which was still deciding what it was going to be. He wrote that he hoped her journey to Oregon had been safe, and that the rain had been better than the storm in Kansas, and that Ruth Foster had probably learned to sit up by now, and that Dorothy Webb's stories were probably still running. He did not write what he actually wanted to say, which was that the wagon bench had felt wrong since she left it, and that he had started to compose sentences in his head throughout the day and realize he was composing them for her. He folded the letter, addressed it to the Columbia River address, and sent it with the Millhaven postmaster. Then he went back to work. Stella received the letter 6 weeks later. She was in her brother Thomas's house, which was solid and warm and smelled like cedar and pine smoke, sitting beside the window in the late afternoon light with a cup of tea that had gone cold. Thomas was outside with his 2 farmhands, and she had the house to herself, which she found she needed occasionally because Thomas was a man of great goodwill and no personal boundaries whatsoever, who expressed love primarily through proximity and volume. She read Perry's letter 3 times. Then she set it on the table beside her cold tea and sat with it for a while, looking at the Oregon mountains outside the window, which were green and wet, and different from Colorado's mountains in the way that 2 different songs about the same feeling are different from each other. She was glad she had come. Thomas was glad she was there. The community was welcoming, and there was a school that needed a teacher, and she had already begun to establish herself within it. She was doing exactly what she had planned. She picked up the letter and read it 1 more time. Then she got out her paper and wrote back. She wrote about Oregon, which was wetter than she had anticipated but greener than she could have imagined. She wrote about Thomas, who was incorrigible but genuinely kind, and who had already introduced her to every person within 10 miles as my sister Stella, who is very smart, so do not try to be clever with her, which had resulted in a certain careful respect from the community that she found both amusing and useful. She wrote about the school, which had 14 children ranging from 5 to 14, and which operated in a building that needed a new roof and better books, both of which she was already working to obtain. She wrote that the rain was constant but not violent, more of a commitment than a statement. She wrote that she had started a small kitchen garden and that the Oregon soil was so willing that things grew almost immediately after planting, as if the earth itself was enthusiastic. She wrote at the very end, after she had said everything practical that she was glad he had written. She wrote it simply and she meant it completely. She signed it, "Yours, Stella Keating." The letters went back and forth for the rest of that year and into the next and took on a rhythm of their own. Perry would write every 2 weeks. Stella would write every 2 weeks. Because of the distance and the post, they were often reading each other's letters in sequences that were slightly out of order, responding to things that had already been responded to from a different angle, so that their correspondence had the quality of a long, layered conversation that was always catching up with itself. By the end of the first year, they had written enough letters that Perry could have bound them into a respectable book. He kept every one of hers in a tin box on the shelf above his bed. He had not told Daniel Carr what was in the tin box, but Daniel had seen him reading and rereading letters with a particular kind of absorption, and had drawn his own conclusions, which he kept to himself with remarkable restraint. The land claim was coming along well. The house was finished by October, 2 rooms solid and tight, with a proper stone fireplace and a door that closed correctly and windows with actual glass, which in Millhaven was still something to be proud of. Daniel had responsibility for the cattle end of the operation, which had expanded from the original 2 thin cows to 12 decent animals, and Perry had developed the farming section, working with the Colorado soil to understand what it wanted to give and what it would not. They had their first real crop in the second summer, barley and some winter squash, enough to sell a portion and keep enough to be comfortable. Perry bought a new coat that fall. He had not thought about it as a particular act until he was wearing it, and then he thought about it quite a lot. The fact that he had bought something good for himself, something that was about looking right as much as being warm. He had not done that in many years. He understood, quietly and without making a large internal announcement of it, that he was thinking about what he looked like from outside himself in a way that had Stella's voice attached to it. He wrote to her about the coat. He was not sure why. He just wrote it down that he had bought a new coat, that it was a good wool one, that the winter was setting in fast and cold and he was glad of it. She wrote back that she was glad he had a good coat, and that the Oregon winter was primarily rain, and that Thomas had given her a pair of waterproof boots that were ugly as sin and essential as breathing, and that she had started teaching the older children in her school to write small essays, and that 2 of them were already better writers than most adults she knew, which she found both encouraging and slightly humbling. At the end of that letter she wrote, "I find myself often wondering what the view from your window looks like. I imagine it is quite fine." He read that sentence several times and then wrote back a full page describing the view in exact detail. The ridge line to the west, the way the morning light came over it and hit the frost on the grass and made the whole lower field look as if it had been given a coat of something precious. The particular blue of the Colorado winter sky, which was a different blue than summer, cleaner and more serious. The creek that ran along the south boundary, which froze in sections in the coldest weeks but always ran somewhere underneath. He ended that letter differently than he usually did. He wrote, "I think you would like it here. I think about that more than I should, most likely. But I think about it." He was aware, as he folded that letter, that he had crossed from one kind of correspondence into another. He sent it anyway. Her response took 3 weeks, which was longer than usual. He told himself this meant nothing. He was not particularly convincing. When her letter arrived, it was longer than her average. She had clearly written it and then come back to it, because the handwriting changed partway through from her usual careful script to something faster and more alive, as if she had stopped editing herself. She wrote about Oregon, about the community, about the school, about Thomas and his cows and his impractical optimism and his enormous good heart. She wrote about a woman named Mabel Chen, who had come with her husband from California and was the most extraordinary gardener Stella had ever encountered, and who had become in the past months a genuine friend. She wrote about the way the Oregon spring was starting to appear even in the middle of winter, small and green and insistent. Then she wrote, "I do not know what it means that you think about it, but I find, if I am being honest, which I prefer to be, that I think about it too. Not just the view, the life that belongs to the view. I think about it and then I put the thought away because there is a great deal of distance between Oregon and Colorado, and distance is a fact, not a feeling. But I wanted to say it because I prefer honesty." Perry sat at his table for a long time after reading that. Then he went and found Daniel, who was in the barn doing something complicated with a fence post, and said, without preamble, "I think I need to take a trip to Oregon." Daniel put the fence post down and looked at him with the expression of a man who has been waiting for exactly this announcement for several months. "About time," Daniel said. "I have not asked her anything yet," Perry said. "Do you intend to?" Daniel asked. Perry looked at the fence post and then at the barn roof and then back at Daniel. "I believe I do," he said. Daniel nodded, satisfied. "I can manage here for 3 weeks," he said. "Maybe 4 if you get delayed." "I am not going to get delayed," Perry said. He got delayed 6 days because of a late spring snow in the mountain passes, which he had not accounted for in his planning and which was entirely humbling. He waited it out in a way station outside a small pass town, playing cards with 3 strangers and losing with philosophical good grace, thinking about Stella's letter and the sentence about distance being a fact and not a feeling. He had a letter in his coat pocket that he had written 3 days before leaving Millhaven. He had written it in his best handwriting, which was better than it used to be because Stella's own letters had inspired him to practice. The letter said things he had not said in any previous letter. It said them plainly, the way he had always spoken, because plainness was the only kind of honesty he knew how to offer. He arrived in the Columbia River country on a Tuesday in April, asking directions to the Keating land from a man at the nearest post office who gave them without curiosity, which was a relief. The road from the post office to Thomas Keating's homestead was 3 miles of muddy track through second-growth forest that smelled like cedar and rain, and the particular green freshness of an Oregon spring. His horse moved through it with the comfortable familiarity of an animal that had covered a lot of ground and was not worried about a little more. He came out of the trees into a cleared area with a proper farmhouse and a barn and a kitchen garden that was beginning to show its early season ambitions, and he pulled up his horse and sat for a moment taking it in. It was exactly what he had imagined from her letters. It was, in its Pacific Northwest way, beautiful. Stella was in the garden. She was kneeling beside a row of early plantings, wearing a practical gray dress and an apron, her hair in its familiar knot with the familiar escapes moving in the Oregon breeze. She had a trowel in her right hand and a handful of something in her left, and she was entirely absorbed in what she was doing, and she had not yet looked up. His horse made a sound as he dismounted, and she looked up. The moment she recognized him, the expression on her face went through several things in very rapid succession. Surprise, genuine and uncalculated, followed by something that he would have been afraid to name if he had not already said what he intended to say in his letter and had therefore already crossed the bridge. He crossed the yard with his hat in his hand, which was the most polite posture he could manage. "Perry Prescott," she said. She was still kneeling. She made no attempt to get up immediately, which was very Stella. "Stella Keating," he said. "You are in Oregon," she observed. "I am," he said. "You did not write that you were coming," she said. "I know," he said. "I apologize for that. I was not entirely certain I could make it through the pass, and I did not want to promise what I was not sure I could deliver." She got to her feet then, and she was brushing the soil from her apron with the hand that held the trowel, and she was looking at him with those green eyes that the Colorado mountains had somehow not made him forget at all, not one single bit in 18 months of letter writing. "How long did the pass take?" she asked. "6 days waiting for snow," he said. "I was delayed. You said in your last letter you did not expect to be delayed," she said, and the corner of her mouth moved in the way he had been dreaming about for better than a year. "I was wrong," he said. "I am occasionally wrong." "Only occasionally?" she asked. "Regularly," he said, "but I prefer occasionally." She laughed, and it was the first time he had heard her laugh since Kansas, and it hit him somewhere in the chest with a precision that no amount of letter writing had prepared him for. Thomas Keating appeared from the barn at that moment, an enormous man with Stella's green eyes and none of her restraint, who spotted Perry and bellowed a greeting across the yard, and came striding over with his hand already extended before he was close enough to shake properly. "You must be Perry Prescott," Thomas said, pumping his hand. "Stella's told me nothing about you." "Thomas," Stella said with a mild warning tone. "I mean she has mentioned you in passing," Thomas said, with the absolute lack of subtlety of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. "In her letters to me, her brother, who she lives with." "It is good to meet you," Perry said with great sincerity. Thomas invited him to stay, and he stayed 4 days, which was longer than he had planned and exactly the right length. He slept in the small room that served as Thomas's guest accommodation, and spent his days helping with the various projects that Thomas always had underway, because the man never stopped working and had an endless supply of tasks that were improved by an extra pair of capable hands. In the evenings, they sat at the kitchen table, all 3 of them, and talked in the way that people talk when they are genuinely comfortable with each other and not performing comfort. Stella made coffee that was strong enough to hold a spoon upright. Thomas told stories about Oregon that were probably 60% accurate. Perry talked about Millhaven and the land and Daniel's perpetual optimism about the cattle. On the 3rd evening, after Thomas had excused himself early with the completely unconvincing claim that he had a very important thing to check on in the barn, Stella and Perry sat on the porch together in the Oregon dusk, and Perry took the letter from his coat pocket. "I wrote this before I left Colorado," he said. "I meant to give it to you when I arrived, but then Thomas was there, and the moment was not quite right." She took the letter. She opened it and read it there on the porch in the last of the evening light, and he watched her read it the way he had once watched her watch the mountains. The letter said, among other things, that he had spent 18 months writing to her, and finding that every letter he wrote to her was the best letter he had ever written, because she inspired him to say what he meant and nothing else. That the land in Colorado was good and the house was solid, and there was room in both for more than one person. That he was not a man who dressed things up, and so he would not dress this up either. He had thought about her every day since a wagon bench in Kansas, and if she was at all inclined toward the same direction, he would very much like to understand what she thought about it. He had not used the word love in the letter because he felt it should be said, not written, when the time came. She finished reading and folded the letter carefully along its original creases and held it in her hands the way she had held her reading list on the morning he had first seen her, with the attention of someone who understands that some things are of great importance. "Perry," she said. "Yes," he said. "I believe," she said, "that I have been writing to you for 18 months because there is nothing in this world I have ever found as interesting as having a conversation with you, and I have spent a good deal of those 18 months being quite frustrating about the fact of distance." "Distance being a fact and not a feeling," he said. "Exactly," she said, and then, "but I find that feelings are also facts." He turned toward her on the porch, and the stars were coming out over Oregon, and the cedar smell was in the air, and she was looking at him steadily with those green eyes, and he said the word love out loud, plainly, the way he said all the true things. She said it back. Thomas, who had been listening from just inside the open window with no shame whatsoever, made a small triumphant noise that both of them pretended not to hear. He proposed to her on the fourth morning in the garden, which was where he had first seen her when he arrived, and which felt right for that reason. He went down on one knee in the Oregon mud without any concern for his trousers, which Stella later said was one of the most romantic things that had happened, not the kneeling itself, but the complete absence of concern for the trousers. He had a ring he had bought from a jeweler in Denver, a simple gold band with a small green stone, which he had found with her eyes specifically in mind, a detail he told her only after she said yes. She said yes quietly and completely and without hesitation, which was exactly how Stella Keating did everything she had decided to do. Thomas came out of the house and shook Perry's hand so vigorously it was nearly medical in nature, and then he hugged his sister in the clumsy, enormous way of a very large man trying to be gentle, and she let him, her cheek against his shoulder, her eyes bright. She went to Colorado with Perry in June of 1874. Thomas came to see them off at the trailhead, and there was a moment when he and Stella stood together before the coach that would take her south toward the mountain passes where Perry's horse was waiting, and Thomas, who was not a quiet man about anything, was quiet. He put his hands on her shoulders and looked at her and said, "You are going to good life, Stella, I know it." "I know it too," she said. She hugged him for a long time. Then she stepped back, squared her shoulders, and got on the coach. They were married in Millhaven in July of 1874, in the small church that had been part of the original town, before the town had fully made up its mind about itself. The minister was a thin, kind man named Reverend Mills, and the congregation was primarily Daniel Carr and Ezra and Dorothy Webb, who had come down from Denver where they had settled after the trail, and several Millhaven families who had become friends over the past 2 years. Dorothy Webb cried through the whole ceremony, which she had warned everyone she would do, and which she did with great commitment. Perry wore his good wool coat. Stella wore a cream-colored dress that she had made herself over the course of the weeks before the wedding, working in the evenings by lamplight in the Colorado house that was now also her house, learning its sounds and its light, and its small peculiarities with the systematic care she brought to everything new. When the minister asked Perry if he took this woman, Perry said yes with a simplicity and a sureness that made Dorothy Webb cry harder. When he asked Stella, she said yes with her chin up and her eyes absolutely clear and her voice entirely steady, and Perry thought that was the bravest and most beautiful thing he had ever seen. The first years of their marriage were the years of building something real. Stella took the position at the Millhaven School, which had previously been run intermittently by various people who had other primary occupations, and gave teaching whatever time they could spare. She reorganized the school the way she had reorganized the Foster wagon on the trail, with systematic clarity, putting the most important things where they could be accessed first. She got new books from Denver. She got the roof repaired by convincing 3 fathers of enrolled students that it was in their direct practical interest to do so, which it was. She expanded enrollment, recruiting children from the outlying farms by making their parents understand that a child who could read and do arithmetic was a better asset to a homestead than a child who could not. She was, within 2 years, one of the most important people in Millhaven, though she would have found the description embarrassing. Perry developed the land with Daniel, expanding the farming operation and improving the cattle quality, selling off the scrawniest animals and reinvesting in better stock with the patience of a man who understood that quality improvement was a long game. He built Stella a proper studio room off the back of the house, with a good window facing south, because she had mentioned once in a letter before they were married that she used to sew in a south-facing window in Missouri and that the light was best there. He had remembered. He built the addition over the course of 2 months, doing most of the work himself on the weekends, and told her only when it was finished. She walked into it and stood in the south-facing light, and did not say anything for a while. And then she said his name in a tone of voice that he could not describe, but that he carried with him for the rest of his life. Their son, William, was born in April of 1876, which was a hard winter and a hard labor, and two of the longest nights of Perry's life, during which he was largely useless and entirely terrified and held Stella's hand, whenever she allowed it, and stayed out of the capable midwife's way when she did not. William arrived in the early morning of a Thursday, making his opinion of the world known immediately and at considerable volume. Perry held him and looked at his red, outraged face, and felt something move through him so large and so fundamental that he had no name for it, and did not try to find one. Stella, exhausted and fierce and still essentially herself in every way, looked at Perry holding William and said, "He looks like you." "Poor boy," Perry said. "Do not say that," she said. "You are very handsome." He had not expected her to say that, and it startled a laugh out of him that he could not contain, and she laughed too, quietly, and it was the most ordinary and most extraordinary moment he had ever lived inside. Daniel Carr, who had remained a bachelor throughout all of this not for lack of trying, but because he had very particular standards, and the range of eligible women in Millhaven's early years was limited, was William's godfather, and took the role with an earnestness that was both touching and slightly excessive. He showed up at the house within 6 hours of the birth with a carved wooden horse that he had been working on for 2 months, having decided that a boy ought to have a carved horse, and presented it to Perry with great solemnity. Perry accepted it equally solemnly. The horse was excellent, in fact. Millhaven grew over those years in the way that Colorado frontier towns grew, not always smoothly, not always fairly, but persistently. New families arrived. Businesses established and failed and re-established. The cattle and farming economy developed its patterns. There were droughts and floods and hard winters and the ordinary violence of life on the frontier, which Perry and Stella navigated with the practicality of people who had come to the West with open eyes. There were harder things, too. The territory's treatment of the Cheyenne and Arapaho peoples, whose land the Colorado settlements occupied, was a wrong that Stella wrote about in letters to Thomas and to Mabel Chen in Oregon, and spoke about when the opportunity arose in Millhaven, where not everyone wanted to hear it. Perry had seen enough, both in his Army years and on the cattle trails, to understand the scale of what was being done, and he never pretended it was something other than what it was. They were raising William in a house where this kind of honesty was expected, because Stella believed that children who were not taught to see clearly grew into adults who could not. Their daughter Clara was born in 1879, named after Clara Foster from the Wagon train, with whom Stella had maintained a correspondence. Clara arrived with considerably less drama than William had, and demonstrated from her first weeks an equanimity that suggested she had already sized up the world and found it acceptable. She had Perry's river-water eyes and Stella's auburn hair, and a personality that was entirely her own, calm, observant, and possessed of an opinion she would share at the appropriate moment regardless of whether anyone had specifically requested it. William adored her from the beginning, which Stella had hoped for but not assumed. He was 3 when Clara was born, and treated her initially as an interesting new phenomenon, then as a companion, then as a partner in the particular enterprises that occupied children who grew up on a farm with a great deal of space and an encouraging set of parents. Daniel Carr, in 1880, married a woman named Helen Burke who had arrived in Millhaven with her widowed father, and who had, apparently, exactly the particular specifications Daniel had been maintaining all this time. She was a quiet, strong-minded woman with a great sense of humor and a practical relationship with the world, and she and Stella became close friends with an ease that suggested they recognized each other. Helen and Daniel had a child in 1881, a boy named James, and the Carr and Prescott households developed the easy overlap of families who have chosen to be neighbors in all the ways that matter. The years went on. William went to Stella's school and then, when he was 17, to proper school in Denver, because Stella had decided that her children would have the education she had always wanted, and she had saved specifically for this purpose over many years, and Perry had added to those savings with equal intention. William went and came back, larger and more confident, with books under his arm and questions on his tongue that kept dinner conversations running long past the meal itself. Clara showed the same aptitude for learning and a specific gift for mathematics that Stella recognized and cultivated. And when Clara was 16, Stella wrote to a school in Denver about their enrollment policies and received a reply that was encouraging. And she and Clara had a long conversation about it that was one of the conversations Stella later counted as the best of her life. Clara went to Denver in 1895, and she came back with a teaching certificate of her own. Thomas Keating came to visit in 1883, making the trip from Oregon with the enormous enthusiasm and comprehensive lack of planning that was his signature style. He arrived in Millhaven looking like something that had been through several weathers, immediately charmed every person he encountered, ate enough at their table to stock a small restaurant, and spent 2 weeks being the best possible version of an uncle to William and Clara, and the worst possible version of a houseguest in terms of finding his belongings in the mornings. Stella, who loved him completely, was glad to have him and gladder when he finally departed, and told Perry so in a tone of complete affection. Perry agreed entirely. In the summer of 1885, when William was 9 and Clara was 6, Perry and Stella sat on the porch of the Colorado house one evening in the particular quality of summer dark that the mountain air produced, with the stars very bright and very many, and the fireflies coming up from the creek grass below the house. The children were in bed. Daniel and Helen had gone home after supper. The land was quiet in all directions. They had been sitting there for a while, not saying much, in the way of people who have the particular comfort of knowing they do not need to fill the silence to sustain the warmth. Perry said, without any particular lead-up, "Do you remember the wagon train out of Abilene?" Stella turned to look at him. "Yes," she said with the slight tone of someone who wonders where a question is going. "There was a seat," he said, "in Ezra Webb's wagon, last seat on the whole train." He looked out at the dark fields and back at her. "A German woman was going to take it and then she changed her mind and walked away, and the seat was beside you." She was watching him with full attention now. "I had no reason to buy a wagon seat," he said. "I had a horse. I had my freight paid. But I walked up to Cletus Horn's table and bought that seat, and I did it because I had just seen you across the staging area holding your list in both hands, and I could not think of a single other thing I wanted to do." Stella was very still. "You did not know," he said. "I never told you. I thought about telling you, and then I thought about how it might sound, buying a seat just to sit next to a woman he had never met, and I decided to wait." He looked at her steadily. "I waited somewhat longer than I expected to." She sat with this for a moment. Outside, the Colorado night moved softly around the porch. "You spent your last money on that seat," she said slowly. "You told me once early on that you had arrived at the land claim with almost nothing." "Yes," he said. "Because you spent it on the wagon seat," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a long time, and then she laughed softly and warmly, the laugh he had spent the better part of his adult life accumulating like something precious. "Perry Prescott," she said. "Yes," he said. "You are ridiculous," she said, and there was so much love in the word ridiculous that it would have rearranged the priorities of anyone who heard it. "I know," he said. She reached over and took his hand, the way she had developed the habit of taking his hand in the years of their marriage, with the ease of complete familiarity and the warmth of something that had not faded at all. "I would have talked to you anyway," she said. "Eventually, I was watching you too." He turned to look at her. "Were you? You were very calm with your horse," she said. "I trust people who are calm with animals." He considered this. "So I wasted my last money," he said. "Not wasted," she said, and she leaned her head against his shoulder in the particular way she had that meant she was completely at peace. You just hurried something that would have happened anyway. Is that all right? He asked. It is better than all right, she said. It is one of the best stories I know. They sat there together in the Colorado dark, with the mountains somewhere behind the night sky and the land around them that they had built into something real and theirs, and the children asleep in the house, and Daniel and Helen a half-mile down the road, and Thomas somewhere in Oregon with his unreasonable optimism and his good heart, and the letters in the tin box on the shelf above the bed where they still were. Not because he had kept them out of sentiment, but because they were the record of the two of them finding each other across a distance that had felt very large and had turned out to be crossable. You should have told me sooner, she said quietly. I know, he said. But then, she said, it would not be the story it is now. He thought about that. About all the intervening years, all the ordinary and extraordinary days that the story had contained. The trail and the letters and the porch in Oregon, and the mud on his knee in the garden, and the church in Millhaven and William arriving in the early morning, and Clara arriving with her equanimity already established, and the school and the land and the south-facing window and Daniel's carved horse and Thomas eating everything in sight, and all the evenings on this porch, and all the years that had run forward from a moment when he had walked to a wagon master's table and made the most impulsive decision of his life. No, he said, it would not. She was quiet for a while, and then she said, Tell me what you thought when you saw me. I thought, he said slowly, that you were reading that list as if it contained the instructions for something important, and I wanted to know what was important to you. And now you know, she said. I do, he said. They sat until the fireflies had all gone back to the grass, and the stars had moved across the sky, and the night was fully dark and fully still. And then they went inside to the house they had built together, leaving the porch to the Colorado dark. In the years that followed, Millhaven continued to grow and consolidate into the kind of established small town that had a proper school with 3 teachers, a functioning court, and a regular mail service that no longer required the patience and faith of the early years. Perry and Daniel expanded their operation and hired 3 hands, and the land that Perry had first walked in the fall of 1872 had become something considerably more than what Daniel's letter had promised. Stella taught until Clara came home with her teaching certificate, and then she continued teaching alongside Clara because she found she could not stop, not because she had to stay, but because she genuinely loved the work and the children and the ongoing project of making sure that the young people of Millhaven could read and think and reckon with the world they were inheriting. William, who had come back from Denver with a strong interest in law and an equally strong interest in a young woman named Margaret who worked in her family's Denver printing shop, brought Margaret home to Millhaven in 1895 and introduced her to his parents with the particular nervousness of a young man who respects his mother's judgment intensely. Stella liked Margaret immediately. She liked her straightforward manner and her ink-stained fingers and the way she held William's hand without performing the gesture. She told Perry so that evening. You could see it in one meeting, he asked. I could see it in 30 seconds, she said. How? He asked. She was not trying to impress me, Stella said. She was just herself. People who are just themselves are worth knowing. Perry considered this and thought about a woman who had said I am fine in a thunderstorm with her chin up and no performance about it, and thought that Stella Keating had always known exactly who she was and had always expected the same of the people around her. Yes, he said, they are. William and Margaret were married in Denver in the spring of 1896, and the ceremony was held in a proper venue that Margaret's family helped organize, and Dorothy Webb, who was now 70 years old and still talking, attended and cried through the whole proceeding exactly as she had cried through Perry and Stella's wedding, which she had also attended, and which she brought up no fewer than 6 times over the wedding weekend, much to Perry's enormous quiet amusement. Clara, who had not yet found anyone she considered worth the trouble, served as her brother's witness with her characteristic composure, and made a speech at the supper that was so precisely observed and warmly funny that Margaret cried and William laughed until his side hurt, which Clara accepted as the proper response. The grandchildren arrived in due course. William and Margaret had a boy they named Arthur in 1897, and Arthur came into the world with his grandfather's calm eyes and his grandmother's insistence on everyone knowing exactly what he wanted, which made Stella laugh when Perry pointed it out. "He is nothing like me," she said. "He is exactly like you," Perry said. She looked at Arthur, who was regarding the world from his blanket with an expression of interested appraisal, and she conceded the point. Perry was 50 years old in 1897, and he looked it in the way of men who have worked outdoors for 30 years, weathered and solid, with gray at his temples and the kind of quietness that comes from a life that has been fully lived rather than merely endured. He had aches in his left knee from an old fall and needed spectacles for reading, which Stella had found and handed to him with the briskness of someone who had decided the issue was not up for discussion, and which he wore without protest because arguing with Stella on practical matters was something he had understood long ago to be a waste of good time. Stella at 50 was exactly herself, perhaps more concentrated. Her hair had gone from auburn to a deep auburn silver that she wore with no concern whatsoever. She still taught mornings at the Millhaven school with Clara. She still kept a kitchen garden that put everyone else's to shame. She still sat on the south porch in the evenings when the light was right and worked on whatever sewing project had her attention, and Perry would come and sit beside her with his coffee, and they would be quiet together in the way that was by now the most familiar and most comfortable thing in either of their lives. Thomas Keating came one more time to Millhaven in 1898, looking somewhat reduced by age but not substantially, still enormous and loud and affectionate, and incapable of finding his boots in the morning. He sat on the porch with Perry in the evenings while Stella was teaching, and the two men talked in the way that men talk when they have been brothers-in-law for a long time and have gotten past the formalities, plainly about the things that mattered without dressing them up. "You make her happy," Thomas said one evening, with the simplicity of someone stating something he considered obvious and important enough to say directly. "She makes me happy," Perry said. "I think we make each other happy." Thomas nodded. He was quiet for a while, which was unusual enough to Mark. Then he said, "I worried when she left for Oregon, when she was alone in Missouri. She is so capable that people forget she might need something." "She does not need much," Perry said, "but what she needs genuinely." "Yes," Thomas said, "and you see it." "I try," Perry said. Thomas looked at the Colorado mountains in the distance. "Good," he said, "that is the thing." In 1900, Perry Prescott sat down at the table that had been in the Colorado house since the early years of their marriage, the same table where he had written his first letter to Stella, and he wrote a letter to Daniel Carr, who had moved with Helen and James to Denver the previous year when Daniel's knees had made the daily ranch work too painful to continue, and who had sold his share of the land operation to Perry and a new partner. The letter was ordinary news, the kind Perry and Daniel exchanged every month. Land things, cattle things, weather, James's progress at the Denver school, Arthur's latest opinions about the world. At the end of the letter, Perry wrote, "It has been 28 years since Abilene. I was thinking about that this morning. I believe it is the best thing I ever did buying that seat." Daniel wrote back 2 weeks later, "I know, I have always known. I remember the way you looked when you came into the barn that day and said you needed to go to Oregon. It is an excellent story. Helen sends her love. We will see you at Christmas." Christmas of 1900 was a large gathering at the Colorado house, which had been extended twice over the years, and now had a proper dining room that could hold the full assembly of Prescotts and Carrs and Keatings and their various additions. William and Margaret came with Arthur, who was 3, and possessed by the particular conviction of a 3-year-old that every object in the house was available for his investigation. Clara came home from Millhaven, where she now had her own small house near the school. Daniel and Helen and James arrived from Denver. The kitchen was full of women cooking, and the porch was full of men standing in the cold, because the house was not large enough for everyone simultaneously, and the men could be trusted with coats. Arthur was carried from lap to lap, and expressed his views on everything with clarity and volume. Dorothy Webb had sent a fruit cake from Denver, where she still lived with her daughter, that was so dense it required a good knife and considerable commitment. After supper, after Arthur had been put to sleep in the upstairs room, and the older children and guests had settled into their various positions, and the fire was burning well, and the house had the quality of warmth and fullness that is not just temperature but something more, Perry and Stella were in the kitchen alone for a moment while she finished putting things away and he dried the last of the dishes. He handed her a plate. She set it on the shelf. He handed her another. She set it beside the first. Outside, Clara was laughing at something Daniel had said. William was telling Margaret something in the low voice he used when he was happy and relaxed. Arthur was quiet, which meant peace reigned. "Good Christmas," Perry said. "Very good," she said. He hung the dish towel on the hook beside the stove and turned and looked at her. She was putting the last plate away, her hands sure and practiced, her silver auburn hair loose on her shoulders because she had taken it down after supper the way she did in the evenings at home. "Stella," he said. She turned to look at him with the full attention she had always given to what he said, the quality of listening that had never changed in 28 years, that made him feel, every time, that what he said mattered. "I would buy the seat again," he said. "Every cent I had, for all of it." She looked at him for a moment with those green eyes that the years had not dimmed at all, that were still the color of deep river water on an overcast day, still lit from within with the particular depth that had struck him sideways in the Abilene staging area on a mud-wet spring morning in 1872. "I know," she said. She stepped forward and put her hand on his chest, the way she sometimes did when a thing was too large for words and she wanted to be close to it anyway. "I know you would." He put his hand over hers. From the other room came the sounds of people he loved, the laughter and the talk and the particular warm noise of a house that was full and safe. Outside, the Colorado night was cold and clean, and the stars were extraordinary, the way they always were at altitude in winter, as if the sky had made a special arrangement with clarity. He had come to Colorado in 1872 with everything he owned in a supply crate and a horse, and the hope of a friend's land claim and nothing else. He was standing now in a kitchen with good plates on the shelves, and a south-facing window beside a studio full of sewing projects and letters in a tin box on a shelf above the bed, and a woman whose hand was warm against his chest, in a house that was built to last, on land that he knew like his own name, with grandchildren in the upstairs room and friends in the next room, and a daughter who taught school in the morning, and a son who would inherit things worth inheriting. He had bought a wagon seat. That was where it started. He had taken every last coin from his pocket and handed it to a wagon master named Cletus Horn in the spring mud of Abilene, Kansas, for a bench beside a woman who was holding a list in both hands and who did not know for 13 more years that this was what had happened. He could not have known, when he did it, what would come from it. He had known only the particular pull of something irresistible, the feeling of a life's direction altering in a direction he could not name but could not ignore. He had followed it with the impulsiveness of a man who was not impulsive and had never regretted it for a single day of the 28 years since. "Are you happy?" he asked her. He asked it the way he occasionally asked, not to check but to hear it from her directly, because she was not a person who said things she did not mean, and hearing her say it was, every time, an act of faith renewed. Stella Keating Prescott looked up at her husband in their kitchen, in their house, on their land, In the last year of a century that had seen them cross mountains and write letters across impossible distances, and build something real out of nothing but intention and work, and the particular stubbornness of two people who had decided they were worth the difficulty. Entirely, she said. Outside, the Colorado night held its cold and its stars and its enormous, permanent mountains. Inside, the fire burned, and the people laughed, and Arthur slept in his room with the carved wooden horse that Daniel had made for his father 24 years ago, because Perry had given it to William and William had given it to Arthur, and it had already lasted a generation and was built to last more. And in the kitchen, Stella and Perry stood in the warmth of all of it, her hand on his chest and his hand over hers, and the story that had started on a muddy spring morning in Abilene, Kansas, with a wagon seat and a last-minute decision, and a pair of green eyes that had rearranged every plan he thought he had, was not a story with an end. It was a story that had grown into a life, and the life was full, and the life was good, and it was exactly what they had both been looking for when they climbed onto a westbound wagon and pointed themselves at the horizon and went.